Hi, welcome back. Now, in this section, we will be looking at the idea of why exactly do we need to do transformations? Because of course, we could just take our queries and write it behind our dashboard, the source data. This is one option. Or we could then also perhaps just, you know, have all this query build up like a table of view, right? And then plug the table of view to the back of our dashboard. This is also interesting point. Or we could then split this, query into parts, right? And then uh, basically build the query as a pipeline, right? So this is what we'll be looking at the moment. Now, we have this query, right, which is basically calculating the extended price, discount extended price, the discounted extended price plus tax, then average quantity, average extended price, and average discount, right? It is calculated based off the database and schema, right? It's calculating it off the database and schema of Snowflake, right? The Snowflake sample data, right? And so, somehow we, we want to sort of like look at the query again and see. Now, when you look at this query, you see that it is kind of, it's relatively complex, perhaps a lot more complex query than this, but just for, this course, we would say it's relatively complex. Because then you have like a couple of joins, you have a couple of joins here and there. Aside from that, you have like a couple of CTEs, which are sort of like doing different types, applications at different levels. For instance, you can see the sum here, you can see the average, and of course you see the window function here as well. At the same time, you also have like another CTE, which is doing some other calculation. And then, of course, you basically have some final, stuff that is happening here. Right. So, if we were to run this query, it probably takes some time because like it's really, really complex. And if we put this query and we just put it at the back of our dashboard, then the dashboard always loads forever. This is a disadvantage, right? In the sense that the dashboard we'll have to scan this every time we put the query. Every time we try to open the dashboard, it has to run this query, and it takes a while to run. This is the first problem. The second problem is the compute. So we pay for compute, like with Snowflake, you pay for compute every time you sort of run your query. So the longer you run the query, then the more you pay. What this essentially means is that if you put this query at the back of your dashboard, what happens is every time somebody tries to open the dashboard, it will run the query and it takes time. And unfortunately, you have to pay a lot of money every time someone tries to access the dashboard. And this is such a problem. And the reason is basically because of the complexity of the query. And most transformations are kind of complex. So this is another problem. Now, another problem is that when we write our queries, of course, we test it based on the samples that we have in the database at that time. Now, there are times when some, some scenarios that we cannot think of is sort of coming into the data, right? That basically breaks our queries. Or maybe something has happened to one of the dependencies, right? Maybe one of the tables has been mistakenly dropped somewhere. And so then our query doesn't work. If we have a very big query like this, it becomes very difficult to actually isolate where the problem is coming from. It's another very big problem because we cannot really say, you will debug, it probably takes a long time. There are queries, you can see queries of 1,000 lines, which is far, far, far bigger than this. You see queries of 1,000 lines and all that. So it probably takes you even more time to sort of debug where the problem is coming from, right? So this is another type of problem. So what are we trying to do here? We will build like a DAG that essentially says, okay, this, basically we will build this into different parts where we sort of come import all these data sources. We first start by identifying what are our data sources, right? This is going to be our data sources for this particular, report. And then when we're done building the data sources, we will build the, we will then come and build like the first data pipeline, which is going to combine all these sources. It's going to do all this calculation, and then we will connect that to another data source that we will build that would also sort of like calculate this new source. And then, of course, at the end of the day, we would have the final calculation of this. Now, why is it important to sort of go with this approach? The first part is, first and foremost, we will have a very clean data that is sort of like a tabular data at the end of the pipeline. And this tabular data will be very easy for our dashboard to just pick and display. This is the first part. So then we don't have to compute a lot. Maybe within 30 seconds or 10 seconds, the dashboard is already showing your data. This makes it very, very smooth and easy for the customer. And the second part, it will also save us the cost of compute, because then perhaps we only run queries for 30 seconds every time we need to open the dashboard. And of course, if we even perhaps use some strategies, if we go with some strategy, we might not always have to run the query every time we open the dashboard, because then we can settle for what we call a materialized view. This is something that we will come to later in the process of building this DAG. Another thing that makes this approach also very interesting and very useful is that we can already start putting tests. In DBT, we have the opportunity to test, right? So we can start putting tests on different sources when we import these sources into DBT, because we will be importing these sources into DBT. So when we are importing the sources, we can already start testing. And why do we have to test? We could be testing the different sources to see if maybe we have some duplicate data. Perhaps we have some columns where we are joining, where we assume that the join is based off a unique value. And so for some reason, perhaps when the data was updated, some of the old data just got mistakenly loaded. We will be able to put a test to identify this so that if we need to make some corrections, it will be possible, and it would essentially avoid like causing problems down the pipeline. Okay, this is one. Another one is that we will be able to also put tests on different CTEs. At least this is what we call them at this point, CTEs in this big query. But when we break it down into different, models, then we will be able to put tests on each of the CTEs. And then we will be able to say, okay, this is where we have the problems if we do have the problems. Another thing is, at times, we use different, perhaps we have to also use this part of the whole pipeline to build the different reports with the different requirements. And once we sort of have this, perhaps once we already have this data, we can reuse that data set to build another, data set without building, multiple, without calculating this particular part of the data set multiple times, right? And so this is another advantage of building with DBT, because then you can use, a certain data set you have created once, you can use it twice. And so these are the things that we'll be looking at in the coming, parts of DBT. The first part in the next is going to be us essentially bringing in these sources. Now, before we go on, in the next video, we will just have a little bit touch on Git. Git is very important because we would be saving all our progress in our GitHub repository. So it's very important we sort of touch Git a bit, just a basic Git. So see you on the next one. Thank you.